All right, so welcome to week 14, which is, as I've said in a number of places, the bonus week. So anything that you do for a grade this week will count as bonus points. So the way that will work, it will be graded just like anything else on the same scale with the same criteria. And so say that a particular assignment in week 14 is worth 2 points, like a lot of the reading sequence assignments are. If for some reason you got a 50, you'd get 1 bonus point, right? That's how it works. So even if you do poorly, that's not going to count against you. Any points at all, even if you just get sort of fractions of a point, will go on top of what you've gotten from all the regular assignments. So don't feel too much pressure to do this. Sort of sit back and soak it in. As I said, this topic I think is very important, very fundamental. The reason why I don't sort of put it more prominently in the course is because, as I said, if you ever take an ethics course that's any good, you will talk about at least one of the things in here. Actually, I think what you'll talk about in a good ethics class will be what I have you read for the discussion in the active reading. But this idea of the foundations of morality is very important. So I really do want you to pay attention and sort of learn this really for your own benefit more than anything else. People tend to base a lot of their moral reasoning on the way things feel to them. And that is not entirely wrong, but we also want to question our moral feelings. So for instance, say that a person has a moral objection to a particular type of relationship, say between two men, two women, between people of different races, between people of large age disparities, whatever it may be, right? We think that all of these, or for the most part, we think that all of these are sort of inappropriate feelings. That is, they're not tracking anything which is actually morally wrong, except for the case of when, the age difference means that one person is a minor and the other person isn't. That we say is morally wrong. However, we don't tend to think, for the most part, for most of us don't think that it matters what the gender of the partners are, what the race of the partners are. That kind of stuff is irrelevant. We do think that family members who have this kind of relationship, we think that's morally wrong, generally speaking. So what is common between all of those feelings, whether they are tracking something moral or not, is disgust, right? When you disapprove of someone's relationship, that you're usually having some kind of disgust reaction to it. But of course, being disgusted by something is not enough to make it immoral, right? There have to be other things involved. There has to be harm involved, right? So the reason why relationships with underage people, with minors, is immoral is because we assume that it harms the minor, right? There's some kind of corrupting influence on them when someone who is much older is trying to engage them in a sort of romantic or sexual relationship. We think it's going to psychologically harm the younger person. So that's why we say it's immoral. It's not because it's icky, right? It is icky, but that's not why it's wrong. Relationships of a sexual or romantic nature between siblings, for instance, it may not harm them. We think that the harm that comes to it is perhaps in the form of the offspring that may come from that kind of relationship. It may be genetically harmful for the offspring that their parents are related in that way, right? So the foundation of sort of moral badness, for the most part, this is a very at least common way of thinking of it, is harm, right? Not disgust. So the fact that something grosses you out does not make it immoral. The fact that it harms somebody makes it immoral. And that's just one particular way of looking at the foundations of morality. We're going to look at some more general discussions about the foundations of morality this week. So this slide presentation is pretty long. I'm going to split it up into two. Again, anything that you do is extra credit, but really, it is worth thinking about these things. So without further ado, let's get started. So when we talk about the foundations of morality, one way we can go with this is into a discipline which is called metaethics. So meta, the prefix, simply means something like above or beyond. Metaphysics, with which we are familiar already, means above physics or beyond physics. So physics in Greek is the study of things which change, right? The physical world, the world of solid objects, of weather, of hamburgers and whatnot, that's stuff that changes. Metaphysics is originally conceived, philosophically, as the study of things which do not change. The stuff behind the physical stuff, above the physical stuff, as it were, right? So that's where that comes from. So metaethics is supposed to be the stuff behind our ethical theorizing, right? It's more fundamental or more abstract, something like that. So ethics, generally, ethics and moral philosophy, we can kind of split it up into a number of different topics. We can talk about axiology and normative ethics, two concepts, two phrases with which we're already familiar. Axiology being the fancy name for value theory. This tells us which things are good, morally speaking. Well, axiology can talk about moral value, epistemic value, practical value, etc., etc. We're concerned with moral value. So moral axiology, moral value theory, tells us which things are good, morally speaking, which things are bad, morally speaking. So, for instance, hedonism is a moral value theory which says the only thing which is morally good is happiness, and the only thing which is morally bad is unhappiness. Normative ethics then, instead of talking about which objects or entities or states of affairs are good or bad, tells us which actions we ought to choose. It's about choiceworthiness. So what should I do rather than what is good? Now, of course, those things are going to be tied up, as we explained way back. Applied ethics, which we haven't looked at too much, we kind of get into the realm of applied ethics when we talk about political philosophy, but applied ethics is usually taken to be a subdiscipline on its own. That's where you're talking about like medical ethics, business ethics. You're trying to figure out an ethical theory, not really a theory, because you're trying to figure out what the ethical thing to do is in a particular situation. Now, it may be that you're simply applying a more abstract theory to that situation to get the answer. It may be that you try and do this in a more case-by-case basis, and you figure out what's the right thing to do here without reference to some overarching theory. So, climate change, healthcare access, correctional reform, AI research, genetic therapy. The topics of applied ethics are endless. Human beings are involved in a lot of, to put it bluntly, a lot of shady shit, right? So we have to think a lot about what we're doing because a lot of the things that we do are constantly poised to harm other people, harm ourselves. They may actively be harming others. They may be sort of have a great potential to harm others. We balance that against the benefit that they cause to others. That's what applied ethics is about. It's the really messy stuff. Metaethics is zooming out, right? Metaethics is talking about what are we doing when we're engaged in ethics? What does it mean? What are we doing when we say this is good, right? So it's talking about talk, essentially. It's talking about moral talk. It's talking about moral rules. What is the nature of these rules? So that's, to a large extent, what we're talking about when we're talking about the foundations of morality. So this may be one of the first times I've mentioned Plato or Socrates, and it's the end of an introductory philosophy course. I think I should get some kind of prize for this. I actually may have mentioned Plato and Socrates before. It's not in any of the. I'm not sure. I may have originally had this topic much earlier in the term. So I may have mentioned Plato or Socrates before, but at least not a lot. And so that's still an accomplishment because there have been people who have said that all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, right? That's not true, but Plato and Socrates are tremendous figures, or this tremendous kind of amalgamated figure in the history of Western philosophy. So who are Socrates and Plato? Well, they are the founders of philosophy, right? I mean, that's how we learn it in a very basic introductory philosophy course. Again, that's relatively inaccurate. It's true that a lot of the arguments that are had in Western philosophy come from the dialogues of Socrates and Plato. But of course, those ideas existed before. They didn't come up with them. They got them from other places. It's just that here is the beginning of the recording of philosophical argumentation. So the topics they write on are legion. The basic subdisciplines that philosophy is divided into kind of come to us from Socrates, Plato, and to a certain extent Aristotle. So they're big deals. That's the point. So one of my favorite things to teach, and this is the thing which I think is most important for people to think about, is the Euthyphro dialogue. So the Euthyphro dialogue is there's sort of a set of 3 dialogues which are at the end of Socrates' life, right? Reporting Socrates sort of going to his trial, that's the Euthyphro. Reporting the trial of Socrates, that's the Apology, I think. And then the Credo, which is Socrates after he's been convicted of corrupting the youth, and while he's talking about how he's going to accept the death sentence that's been given to him, and sort of consoling his family and telling people, look, don't be afraid of death, you big weenies. It's better to die, living by your principles than go off into exile and dishonor. That's kind of the deal that he's putting forward there. So the Euthyphro is the first of these 3. Socrates is on his way to be tried, and he meets up with Euthyphro. We won't tell much of the story. You can go on the MIT Classics website and find this a good translation of this dialogue for yourself. If you look up Euthyphro dialogue on YouTube, you'll get some weird animated videos with robots talking to each other in the dialogue, so you can look at it that way. It's worth a listen or a read. So when I say dialogue, I mean it's like a play script, right? It says Socrates, blah, 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 Euthyphro, blah, 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 and they're talking back and forth. These dialogues tend to be named after the primary interlocutor, that is, the primary person in conversation with Socrates. So what's the topic of the Euthyphro? Generally speaking, the topic is the nature of piety, piety being the state of being pious, which is kind of a religious attitude, acting in a particularly religiously prescribed way, following the religious rules, something like that. And the relation of piety to the attitudes of the gods. So this is often recast, instead of being about piety, about being sort of moral goodness or rightness. Because piety is not something with which we are terribly concerned anymore. It's much more secularized. We're concerned with goodness or rightness. And you can recast this question in the same way. What is the nature of moral goodness, moral rightness, and what is its relation to the attitude of any kind of divine being that may exist? So the Euthyphro dilemma goes like this. What is moral is either moral because God commands it, or it is not. If what is moral because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary and vacuous. So the idea here is that if something is good simply because God says so, then one day murdering people could be bad, and then the next day murdering people could be good just because God changed its mind, right? That's the arbitrary point. And the vacuous point means that there's no substance to moral truths if they are simply the whims of some divine being. Okay, so that's supposed to be, well, look, it looks kind of bad for morality to be based on the commands of God. What's the other option? Well, if what is moral for reasons other than that God commands it, then God is superfluous from the standpoint of morality, right? So if we don't want to base what is good on the commands of God, then it has to be based on something else. Excuse me. But if that's true, then the commands of God are sort of meaningless, morally speaking. Sure, God may say, murder is bad, but murder is bad for some other reason, right? And God is recognizing that just like the rest of us. So at best, then, the commands of God could be a shortcut to figuring out what's right or wrong. It's something that you could figure out on your own. It's something that's true independent of what God thinks. And so, theoretically and logically speaking, the commands of God are superfluous. So, given that these are the two possible situations, the conclusion of the Euthyphro dilemma is either morality is arbitrary and vacuous, or God is superfluous to morality. Now, usually what you get here, you get the Euthyphro dilemma posed as a dilemma for a particular idea of morality, not for morality in general. So usually the dilemma is a dilemma for what's called divine command theory. Divine command theory says that what is right if and only if God commands it. What is wrong if and only if God forbids it. That's the divine command theory. So when you put the Euthyphro dilemma into the context of divine command theory, what you get is, well, if things are right if and only if God commands them, then they're arbitrary. If God's command has nothing to do with it, then God's command is sort of irrelevant. So either way, divine command theory has big problems. That's usually how it goes. But we're looking at the Euthyphro dilemma outside of that context. So how do we analyze this? This dilemma comes from the question that's arrived at towards the end of the Euthyphro dialogue, which is often referred to as the Euthyphro problem. What is that problem? The problem is as follows. Do the gods love something because it is pious, or is something pious because the gods love it? This is what I refer to as an order of analysis issue. So, order of analysis is a really handy concept, I find. It's basically figuring out what part of, or what concept is doing the most fundamental work, is doing the heavy lifting, as it were, in an explanation. So, if the gods love something because it's pious, then we have this option here, that something is, it's the first one, that something is loved by the gods because it's pious. Oh, it's the second one. Piety causes God love, right? In the Euthyphro, they talk about something having the property of being God loved. It's a very strange way of talking, but that's how they do it. So, if piety itself comes first and God love comes second, then God love doesn't do any explanatory work. Piety does, right? The fact that something is independently pious is what makes the action choice-worthy. The opposite way, so switching their position here in the chart, if we say that God love comes first and that whatever is God loved is pious, well then piety is kind of an after effect. The property of being God loved does most of the work. So that's the question posed by, do the gods love something because it is pious, or is something pious because the gods love it? Which thing does the work? And you can ask this question in a lot of philosophical contexts to try and figure out what the more fundamental concept is, the concept that determines the other things that are going on. So the dilemma says, the Euthyphro dilemma says that either of these kind of is not good, right? A dilemma is a situation in which both options are bad in some way. And as I said, this is usually presented for those who are trying to endorse a divine command theory. And so here's a more complete formulation of divine command theory. Something is good or right or virtuous if and only if divine beings have a positive attitude towards it. So this positive attitude could be approving of it, commanding it, loving it, so forth. And then something is bad or wrong or vicious if and only if divine beings have a negative attitude towards it, where these attitudes could be disapproving, forbidding, and hating, right? And so a strict dilemma is characterized by these three facets here. So a dilemma is not just a hard choice. A dilemma is a choice in which you have only two options. You can pick only one of those options, and there is no third option. And additionally, whichever option you pick, it's bad. So exhaustive options is the one which is saying there's not a third choice, right? A true dilemma is one in which there are only two choices. So that's why some people talk about, if you've ever heard the idea of a false dilemma, that's a sort of argumentative fallacy where someone is presenting you a situation as if there are only two options, but there are really three or more. We are stipulating that there are only two options here. And the way that you construct that is you usually say, well, the options are either A or not A. That is exhaustive, right? Whenever you have A or not A, right, if something is set up in that way, either it's raining or it's not raining. There is no in between. Either you are alive or you are dead. Excuse me, that's not right. Either you are alive or you are not alive, right? Just putting not in front of something kind of covers all your bases. Now, sometimes this doesn't tell you much. So for instance, this is not a table. This is also not a table. This is also not a table, right? So when we say something is either a table or not a table, we don't necessarily say much about it. So you can, sometimes the exhaustiveness of options kind of makes the choices rather thin, as it were. But in any case, that's one of the criteria of a strict moral dilemma. This idea that the options are mutually exclusive means that there are really only two options, and if you pick one, that prevents you from picking the other, right? So if you go to the restaurant and they say, do you want soup or salad? They mean one, the other, but not both, unless you pay extra, right? You don't get to say, yes, I'll take both. They'll be like, no, you have to choose unless you want to pay extra, right? Then universally negative just means that whichever one you choose, you do something bad, something goes wrong. So think of Sophie's choice, right? Pick which one of your children has to die. Whichever one you pick, something awful occurs, and something which is similarly awful, right? They're awful in the same way. That is sort of your typical moral dilemma is Sophie's choice. So that's what the Euthyphro dilemma is. And so when we say if what is moral because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary and vacuous, that just means that God could command anything and it would be morally right. And that's supposed to be counterintuitive, right? The idea that murder, torture, rape, etc. would become morally right just because God commands it is supposed to make no sense, right? So these things are morally bad and perhaps forbidden no matter what God says. That's the idea. So both the arbitrariness, the fact that it could switch back and forth on a daily basis, and the fact that things which just seem absolutely and totally wrong in all circumstances could be right under the idea that under divine command theory strikes people as massively counterintuitive. So that leaves us the other choice. If what is moral for reasons other than that God commands it, then God is superfluous from the standpoint of morality. So if torture is wrong simply because it causes somebody suffering, so we're talking about, to simplify, we should talk just about sadistic torture. Obviously, torture to gain information from a suspect is also morally wrong. I say obviously because I think it's obviously wrong. But to sort of get rid of any conflicting intuitions, we're just imagining somebody who's torturing another person for fun, right? This is wrong because you shouldn't inflict harm on people for fun, right? It's just wrong, okay? Just because it causes harm, and there is no benefit, no legitimate benefit from it that makes it wrong. God could not exist, and torture would still be wrong. That's the idea. So this harkens back to the idea of non-theism that we discussed way back in week 1. This is this idea that things are right or wrong independent of God's attitudes is simply to say that God is irrelevant morally speaking. So that's the other prong of the dilemma. Either morality is arbitrary because it's based on God's commands, or it's independent and God is morally irrelevant. So you can see why this is a dilemma for the divine command theorist, because either God's command doesn't matter, and of course divine command theory has to think God's commands matter, or making God's commands matter sort of screws up the moral picture in a way that is counterintuitive. Okay, so that's the first argument that they're going through in this presentation. This is sort of one of the most important philosophical arguments I think anyone can look into, because not only for its ethical and moral edifying effects, allowing you to sort of think about, oh, why are things right and wrong? Is it because a certain type of person or a certain type of entity says so, or is it because of some objective fact, or some other reason that we haven't explored? That's very important in and of itself. But also the more generic idea of an order of analysis comes out of this. And this is a very powerful tool for you to use in all kinds of domains outside of ethics, outside of philosophy even, to try and just picture for yourself which concept, which entity is doing the fundamental work. So you can, as it were, draw, I guess, kind of a flow chart like I did up a few slides, tracking the causal progression or the conceptual progression of something. It's a generally useful analytic tool. So I'm going to cut this off here, and then I'll come back with the second half of the week 14 slides.